The sun set low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the barren, cracked ground of the desert planet. It was a world forgotten by time, an unforgiving wasteland where life clung to the edges of survival. In the midst of this desolation, Giara, the rebellious alien princess, fought for her life. Just hours before, she had led a fierce raid against the enemy alliance, determined to disrupt their power. But betrayal came swiftly, as it always does among the power-hungry. Giara's own allies, the very people she had trusted with her life, turned their weapons on her, their faces twisted with malice as they left her for dead on this forsaken planet, their cold laughter echoing in the distance as they flew away, leaving her to perish alone. Giara had always been different from the others in her royal family. While they had clung to their throne and their power, she had fought for something greater: freedom. She had led the rebellion against the corrupt government that ruled her people with an iron fist. But in the end, it was her own people who had sold her out to preserve their own power. And now she was alone, wounded and abandoned, her body broken, her spirit still burning with defiance. The sand was scorching beneath her, but Giara pushed on, dragging herself across the wasteland, each breath painful, each movement slower than the last. Her once pristine armor was now a twisted mess of metal and blood, her clothes torn and shredded from the battle. She had no strength left, but her pride kept her moving. She had to survive. She had to fight back. But the odds were stacked against her. The planet, once home to a thriving civilization, had long since fallen into ruin. Its cities were buried beneath the sands, and its once great technology was now little more than forgotten relics of a bygone era. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and dust, and strange alien creatures roamed the planet, predators that were only too eager to make a meal out of the helpless. Giara's vision blurred as her blood stained the sand beneath her. She had lost too much. Her communication devices were useless, destroyed in the attack. There was no way to call for help, no way to contact her people or her allies. She was completely alone. Then, just as she thought she might succumb to the planet's unforgiving heat, she heard it. A distant sound, like the roar of an engine cutting through the silence of the desert. At first, she thought it was a mirage, the last trick her exhausted mind played on her. But no, it grew louder, and soon she could feel the ground trembling beneath her. A ship. A rescue. Could it be her people returning to finish the job, or perhaps someone else, another alien faction searching for the princess they had abandoned? Giara's heart raced with a mixture of hope and fear. She had no strength left to fight, no power to defend herself. She could only lie there, her broken body barely able to move, and wait to see who, or what, would come. The ship descended from the sky, its massive form cutting through the orange haze of the sunset. It was unlike any ship Giara had ever seen before. The technology was advanced, sleek, and well-maintained. This wasn't an alien craft from her world. No, this was something different, something human. She had heard of the humans. Their world had once been the subject of countless stories, a species known for their resilience and their ability to overcome any obstacle, no matter how insurmountable. The stories had painted them as fierce, unpredictable, and incredibly dangerous. But Giara had never encountered one before. She had always thought of humans as a curiosity, something distant and irrelevant. Until now. The ship's landing gear slammed into the sand, sending up a cloud of dust. The hatch opened with a hiss, and a figure stepped out. He was tall, dressed in combat armor, his face obscured by a helmet. A human soldier. Giara's instincts screamed at her to be wary, to fight back. But her body refused to listen. She was too weak, too injured to move. The soldier paused when he saw her. For a moment, there was only silence between them. The man looked at Giara, his eyes scanning her battered form. There was no fear in his gaze, only cold calculation. He could easily leave her here, abandon her as everyone else had. But he didn't. Instead, the human soldier knelt beside her, his armored gloves reaching for her. Giara's pride flared, and she tried to pull away, to fight him off. She had always fought back, always stood her ground. But her limbs refused to cooperate. With a flick of his wrist, the human soldier expertly patched up her wounds, stabilizing her with a quick, practiced touch. There was no hesitation in his movements. "I'm not your enemy," he said, his voice muffled but clear through his helmet. Ziara's eyes narrowed. She wanted to argue, to tell him she didn't need help, but her words failed her. The pain was too much, the exhaustion too overwhelming. All she could do was stare at the soldier, her mind racing with 1,000 questions. Who was he? Why was he here? Before she could react, the sound of an approaching storm reached them. The wind howled as the sand began to swirl, the storm growing stronger with every passing second. The soldier didn't hesitate. He grabbed her, pulling her to her feet, and they began to move, the storm closing in around them. As they trudged forward, Ziara couldn't help but wonder. Was this a chance for survival, or was it another trap? Her instincts screamed to resist, but something inside her told her that this human soldier might be her only hope. For now, all she could do was follow and wait for answers. Zara's body felt like it was being dragged across the burning desert, her limbs too weak to move on their own. The human soldier held her up, supporting her as they stumbled through the swirling sandstorm. The howling wind stung her skin, but she barely noticed. Her focus was on him, the soldier who had saved her life, the man who had, against all odds, come to her aid. At first, Zara had thought she was dreaming. A human, on a distant desert planet. It didn't make sense. The human race was far away, isolated from the vast alien empires. They had never shown any interest in her world, and yet here he was, carrying her through the storm like she mattered to him. Zara couldn't understand it. Why would a human help her? He had no reason to do so. She was an alien princess, a symbol of everything he should hate. But the soldier didn't ask questions. He didn't seem scared of her, despite knowing she was part of an alien rebellion. Instead, he focused on the task at hand, keeping them both alive. Zara tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper. She was too weak, too injured to say anything meaningful. The storm made it impossible to see, and her surroundings were a blur of sand and wind. She could feel her consciousness slipping, the edges of her thoughts growing fuzzy. Her mind kept drifting back to the betrayal, how her closest allies had turned on her, leaving her to die alone. She couldn't let herself think about that now. If she did, she would lose whatever small amount of strength she had left. But the human's presence was strange. His armor, though clearly designed for battle, wasn't intimidating. It was functional, simple, and practical. He wasn't trying to make a statement or show off. Zara couldn't decide if that made him more dangerous or less. There was something about the way he moved, the way he carried himself. He wasn't acting like a soldier. He wasn't acting like someone who had been trained to fight, to kill. He was focused on survival, on hers and his own. They reached a small outcrop of rock, a rare bit of shelter in the desert wasteland. The soldier lowered her gently onto the ground and crouched beside her. Zara felt his hands on her armor, carefully unfastening it. She tried to stop him, to tell him to keep his distance, but her body didn't respond. Instead, her mind screamed for her to fight, to push him away, but she was too weak. "You're going to be all right," he said, his voice muffled but comforting. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you." Zara couldn't believe what she was hearing. Not going to let anything happen to me, she thought. He didn't even know who she was. He didn't know what she represented. He didn't know the danger he was putting himself in by helping her. The empire she was a part of wasn't something humans could easily take on. And yet, here he was, taking the risk without a second thought. She wanted to ask him why, to demand an explanation, but her strength was gone, and her words were swallowed up by the storm. She could only watch as he worked. There was something oddly calming about the way he moved, almost as if he had done this many times before. His hands were steady as he applied first aid to her wounds, working quickly and efficiently. She noticed the faint markings on his armor, the insignia of his military unit, and her mind raced. Was he from a special forces group, someone sent to kill her? The more she thought about it, the less sense it made. If he had wanted her dead, she would already be gone. "I'm Jack," he said as he worked, almost as if reading her mind. "Jack Carter. You can call me Jack." Zara's mind felt heavy. Jack. The name meant nothing to her, but there was something about the way he said it, something so casual, that made her feel safe. She shook the feeling away. She couldn't afford to trust him. Not yet. The storm raged outside, the wind howling like a beast searching for prey. Jack moved quickly, setting up a small shelter. He spoke quietly to her, explaining what he was doing, as though they were two comrades in a war instead of an alien princess and a human soldier. It was a strange familiarity, but Zara couldn't help but listen. His voice was calm and steady, a sharp contrast to the chaos of the desert around them. As the shelter took shape, Jack went to work on his own gear, checking his weapons, his survival equipment. He didn't look at her, but Zara knew he was aware of her presence. She could feel his eyes occasionally glancing at her, sizing her up, but there was no fear, no hesitation. Zara couldn't figure it out. Why didn't he fear her? He knew nothing about her, nothing about the war she had been fighting, nothing about the countless battles she had survived. He should have been terrified, or at least wary. She was a princess of a powerful empire, a symbol of everything he had been taught to hate. Yet he treated her like a wounded animal in need of help, nothing more. Jack glanced up at her, sensing her gaze. "You're wondering why I'm helping you, aren't you?" Zara froze. She hadn't meant to reveal her thoughts, but it was clear he had read her expression. She wanted to say something, to argue that she didn't need help, but the words died on her lips. Instead, she nodded slightly, unsure of what to think. Was it some sort of trick? Was he trying to get information from her? He was calm, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than met the eye. "I'm not here to hurt you," he continued. "I'm not one of those soldiers. I don't care about your empire. I care about keeping both of us alive." Zara's mind raced. Was he lying? Was this some sort of human trick? They had been known to be clever, to deceive their enemies when it suited them. She couldn't be sure, but one thing was certain. She was too weak to fight back now. She had no choice but to trust him, for the moment. "All right, Jack," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "But don't think I'll be grateful." Jack smiled, a small, genuine smile. "Don't worry. I'm not expecting you to." The storm outside continued to rage, but for the first time in hours, Zara allowed herself to close her eyes. The warmth of the shelter, the quiet hum of Jack's equipment, and his calm presence filled the silence. Despite herself, she found a small bit of comfort in the moment, but deep down, she knew it wouldn't last. The danger was far from over. She was still stranded on an alien world, and the enemies who had betrayed her were out there, waiting. And yet, for the first time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for survival. The shelter was small but effective, a temporary haven in the midst of a brutal desert storm. Jack had built it quickly, his movements precise and efficient. Zara lay inside, her eyes closed, listening to the howling wind outside. Her body was still weak, aching from the wounds and exhaustion, but her mind was sharp, constantly turning over the situation she found herself in. A human, a soldier. Jack. She didn't trust him, not yet, but she couldn't deny the fact that he had saved her life. The storm outside was relentless, the sand biting against the shelter's walls. It felt like the planet itself was fighting against their survival. Zara's thoughts kept drifting back to the betrayal. Her allies, the ones she had fought beside for years, had turned on her without hesitation. They had left her to die on this forsaken world. The anger that burned in her chest was enough to make her want to tear apart everything in her path. But for now, there was nothing she could do. She had no strength, no weapon, No way of reaching her people. The only thing that mattered now was survival. Jack was sitting on the opposite side of the shelter, tinkering with his equipment. He glanced up occasionally, his eyes catching hers, but neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, filled with unspoken questions. Ziara could feel his gaze, but she refused to let herself be vulnerable. He was human, after all. His people had always been seen as enemies, distant and foreign. They were a species that had fought to protect their own, with little care for others. Ziara's people had never trusted them, and she had been taught to view them with suspicion. Yet, here he was. He had saved her life, and for that she couldn't deny a sense of gratitude, even if it made her uncomfortable. Jack's voice broke the silence. "You should try to rest." Ziara stiffened, her instincts kicking in. Rest? She couldn't afford to rest. She had to be ready, alert. She had to be prepared for whatever came next. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something in his gaze. Was it concern? She quickly pushed the thought away. It didn't matter. "I'm fine," she said, her voice hoarse. "I don't need rest." Jack didn't argue, but he didn't look convinced either. He simply nodded and went back to his work. The small fire he had started earlier flickered softly in the corner, casting a warm glow over the shelter. The light danced on the walls, creating strange shadows that made the whole place feel even more isolated from the rest of the world. Ziara stared at the fire, the warmth soothing, but her mind refused to quiet. It wasn't just the storm that kept her awake. It was the uncertainty. She had no idea who Jack was, where he came from, or why he was here. Was he truly just a soldier doing his duty, or was there something more? And what did he want from her? She couldn't shake the feeling that this was all too convenient. A human soldier finding her, a princess of an alien empire, stranded on a deserted planet. It didn't make sense. "Why are you helping me?" Ziara asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence. She didn't mean to ask, but the question had been burning in her mind for hours. She had to know. She had to understand why he had chosen to save her when he had no reason to. Jack paused, looking up at her with a steady expression. He didn't answer right away, and for a moment, Ziara wondered if he would just ignore her question. But then he spoke, his voice calm and matter-of-fact. "I don't need a reason," he said. "You needed help. I helped. Simple as that." Ziara scoffed, disbelief flickering in her eyes. "It's not that simple." He raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Maybe not, but you're here. I'm here. And we're both alive. That's what matters right now." Ziara was silent for a moment, processing his words. His answer wasn't what she had expected, but it was also strangely comforting in its simplicity. There was no hidden agenda, no secret motive, just a man who saw someone in need and decided to help. It was a foreign concept to her. Her whole life had been spent surrounded by people who always had an ulterior motive, a hidden agenda. It was hard to trust anyone who didn't operate the same way. But Jack was different. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that he had no reason to lie to her. He didn't care who she was or where she came from. He wasn't here to take advantage of her, or at least, that's what it seemed like. He had saved her life without expecting anything in return. And for the first time since her betrayal, Ziara felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe there was more to this human than she had assumed. "What's your story, Jack?" she asked, her voice softer now, more curious than defensive. Jack looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing whether or not to answer. Finally, he sighed, leaning back against the shelter wall. "I was part of a rescue mission," he said. "We were supposed to be helping a colony on a neighboring planet, but things went south. The mission went wrong, and I ended up alone here. I've been stuck on this planet for a while now, trying to find a way off. That's when I found you." Ziara listened closely, absorbing his words. It made sense, in a way. If he had been part of a rescue mission, he might have been in the area for a reason, not just by chance. And if he had been stranded here as well, then perhaps they shared a common goal: survival. "So, you're stranded too?" Zyara asked, surprised by the realization. She had assumed he was some kind of elite soldier on a mission, not someone in a similar situation to hers. "Yeah," Jack replied with a half-smile. "Looks like it." Zyara felt a strange connection to him then, a shared understanding. They were both in a hostile environment, both fighting to stay alive. She may have been an alien princess, but in that moment, she was just another survivor, just like Jack. And that thought, it surprised her. "I guess we're in this together, then," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. Jack gave her a simple nod, as if he knew exactly what she meant. The air between them was still thick with tension, but something had shifted. The walls that Zyara had built around herself, walls that she had spent her life carefully constructing, were starting to crack. She wasn't sure why, but for the first time since she'd been betrayed, she didn't feel so alone. The storm raged outside, but inside the shelter, the two unlikely companions shared an unspoken bond. Their worlds were different, their lives torn apart by war and betrayal, but for now, they were united by a common need to survive, and in that shared struggle, something was beginning to change between them. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a start. The desert wind howled outside, relentless and unyielding, as Zyara and Jack sat in their makeshift shelter. The night was still, but a sense of unease hung in the air, thick with the anticipation of something to come. Zyara's body ached from the wounds, but her mind was alert, her instincts screaming that danger was near. Jack sat quietly across from her, his face illuminated by the dim glow of the fire, his posture tense, as if he could feel it too. The desert planet they had crash-landed on was a place of death and desolation, but the storm had finally subsided, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Zyara's thoughts swirled. The planet was abandoned by her people. It had been left to rot after the fall of the rebellion's last stronghold. But the stillness now wasn't just the absence of the storm. It felt like the calm before a storm, something far more dangerous than nature. Zyara sat up, her hand instinctively resting on the blaster she had taken from Jack's gear. Her mind flashed to the last battle, to the traitors who had left her stranded, and then to the enemy, her own people who had betrayed her. They wouldn't let her live, especially not now, when she was weak and helpless. She had failed to prevent the rebellion's downfall. The enemy had no reason to let her escape. Jack noticed her shift, his eyes narrowing. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low, a sign he knew something was wrong too. Zyara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she let her senses take over, feeling the air, the sounds, the vibrations in the ground. Something was out there. Something large. Her sharp alien senses could pick up even the slightest shift in the atmosphere. She could feel the presence of danger, looming just beyond the reach of the shelter. "I think they're coming," Zyara muttered, her voice barely above a whisper, but it held an urgency that made Jack's muscles tense. Jack stood instantly, his hand grabbing his weapon. "Who's coming?" "The enemy. They know I'm here," she said. "They'll come for me. They won't leave me alive. Not after what happened." Jack looked around quickly, scanning their surroundings. The shelter they were in wasn't much, just a small hollow in the sand surrounded by jagged rocks. It was hidden enough to keep them safe for a little while, but not for long. The enemy would know where to look. They had already tracked her once, and they would do it again. "We need to move," Jack said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. Now, Zyara didn't argue. She knew he was right. They couldn't stay here. Not with the enemy closing in. They had no choice but to run, to find somewhere more defensible. But as she got to her feet, a loud noise cut through the silence, a crackling sound that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The ground beneath them trembled, and she could hear the unmistakable hum of energy weapons. "They're here," she said, her voice grim. "They found us." Jack didn't hesitate. He grabbed Zyara's arm, pulling her toward the opening of the shelter. "Come on. We have to go now." They ran, the sand beneath their boots shifting with every step. The enemy's presence was growing stronger by the second. Jack's trained eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of movement. But there was no time to think. They had to act. Suddenly, the air around them crackled with energy, and a burst of light flashed from the darkness. A weapon, fired from nowhere, struck the rock just inches from Zara's face, sending fragments flying in all directions. She ducked instinctively, pulling Jack down with her as the blast tore through the air. "Stay down," Jack shouted, his voice urgent as he pulled out his weapon, aiming it toward the direction of the attack. But there was no sign of the enemy. They were cloaked, hidden in the desert night. Zara's heart raced as she pushed herself back up, her hand gripping her blaster tightly. "They're using cloaking technology," she said, her mind working to process the situation. "We can't see them," Jack cursed under his breath, his finger tightening on the trigger of his gun. "We can't fight what we can't see." But Zara was already moving, her alien instincts taking over as she used her senses to track the enemy's movements. Her heart beat faster as she could feel the faint vibrations in the sand, the slight shifts in the air as their cloaked enemies moved closer. "Over there," Zara yelled, pointing toward a nearby ridge. "They're coming from that direction." Jack didn't question her. He adjusted his aim and fired, the blaster's energy crackling in the silence of the desert. The shot missed, but it was enough to make the cloaked figures hesitate. For a split second, their outlines shimmered in the air, giving them away. Zara fired, her shot finding its mark. One of the cloaked figures collapsed to the ground, its cloaking device flickering and failing as the figure became visible. But there were more. So many more. The next few moments were chaos. Jack and Zara fought side by side, their guns blazing as they took cover behind rocks and debris. The enemy moved swiftly, their cloaking technology making them almost impossible to track, but Zara's sharp senses and Jack's quick reflexes gave them an edge. Every time the enemy appeared, even for a split second, they fired, taking out one or two before the figures vanished into the night again. A sharp pain suddenly flared in Zara's side. She gasped, her body jerking as a blast grazed her. Blood seeped through her armor, but she ignored it, focusing on the enemy. The pain was nothing compared to the fear of losing Jack, of being trapped in this endless battle. She couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not after everything she had already lost. "Zara," Jack called out, his voice filled with concern as he rushed to her side. But she pushed him away. She wasn't going to let him babysit her. Not now, not when they were fighting for their lives. She lifted her weapon, firing again. This time, the blast hit its target, a cloaked figure falling to the ground, its disguise vanishing as it collapsed. But it wasn't enough. The enemy was relentless. They were closing in. "We can't keep this up," Jack said, his voice tight with strain. "We need to get out of here. Now." Zara's mind raced. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The enemy was everywhere, and their technology was too advanced. But they couldn't just surrender. They couldn't give up. "Move toward the ridge," Zara shouted. "We'll take them out one by one." And so, they'd fought on, their bodies bruised and their spirits tested. With every shot fired, every enemy downed, the pressure mounted. They were in a battle they couldn't win, but they weren't giving up. Not yet. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and the distant crackle of energy blasts. The fight had been brutal. Jack and Zara had fought side by side, but the enemy was relentless. Zara's side throbbed with pain from the wound she had taken earlier, but the adrenaline kept her moving. She refused to show weakness. She couldn't afford to. Jack was still by her side, his face streaked with dirt and sweat, but his eyes never wavered. They had to get out. The enemy was closing in, their cloaked soldiers surrounding them on all sides. Zara's mind raced. There had to be a way out of this. She couldn't let Jack die because of her. She couldn't let herself be captured again, not after everything she had already lost. The pain in her side was growing worse, but she pushed it down. They had no time for weakness. She turned to Jack, locking eyes with him. There was an unspoken understanding between them now. They were in this together, and they weren't going down without a fight. "Jack, we need to move. We can't hold them off much longer," Zara said through gritted teeth. Her voice was firm, but the fear beneath it was hard to conceal. Jack nodded, his eyes hard with determination. "We'll make it out. We just need a plan." Zara scanned their surroundings. The desert was vast, but the ridge they had been fighting from offered them little protection. They needed to reach higher ground, somewhere they could see the enemy's movements, a place to regroup and plan their next move. But they didn't have much time. The enemy was closing in faster than she had anticipated. "There's a cave up ahead," Zara said, pointing toward a distant rock formation. "We can make it there. It's our only chance." Jack didn't hesitate. He was already moving, pulling Zara along as they sprinted through the desert, their footsteps barely audible in the howling wind. The cave was small, hidden beneath a cluster of jagged rocks. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give them some cover. They made it inside, breathing heavily, their bodies covered in sweat and dirt. The cave was dark, the air thick with dust. Zara leaned against the wall, her breathing ragged as she tried to ignore the pain in her side. Jack was checking their weapons, his hands moving quickly, efficiently, but his eyes never left her. "You're hurt," he said softly, his voice filled with concern. "We need to stop the bleeding." Zara shook her head. "I'll be fine. We don't have time for that." Jack gave her a hard look, clearly not agreeing, but he didn't push it. They were both injured, both exhausted, but they still had to survive. They still had a chance. "Listen," Jack said after a moment, his voice low. "We're not getting out of this unless we do something drastic." Zara's eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting?" Jack's face was grim, the weight of their situation settling in. "I'll stay behind and cover you. You take the chance and make it to the ship. You're the only one who can escape. You're the princess. They'll want you alive. I can hold them off. I can buy you enough time." Zara's heart clenched at the thought. "No, I'm not leaving you." Jack met her gaze, his eyes full of resolve. "You have to. This is the only way. I'm not going to make it out of here, but you can. You have to survive. You're the future of your people." Zara shook her head, refusing to accept it. "I won't leave you behind." But Jack's expression softened, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have a choice. You're the one they want. You're the one who can make a difference." For a moment, Zara felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. She had always been a fighter, a warrior who had never backed down from a challenge. But this was different. Jack was giving his life for her. He was sacrificing everything so that she could survive, so that she could go on and make a difference for her people. The realization hit her like a blow to the chest, leaving her breathless. "I'm not going to let you die," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. Jack's hand reached out, gently taking hers. "You have no choice. I'm already dead. But you have to live. You have to keep fighting." Tears welled in Zara's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had been through too much, lost too much. She couldn't break down now. Not when it mattered most. Jack's words hit her like a storm, a truth she didn't want to accept, but knew she had to. She couldn't afford to lose him, but she had no other choice. She had to make it out. "I'll make sure your sacrifice means something," Zara whispered, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Jack smiled, the faintest hint of relief crossing his face. "That's all I can ask for." They both stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the decision heavy between them. Jack had made his choice, and Zara knew she had to honor it. She had to be the one to live, to fight for her people, to make sure Jack's sacrifice wasn't in vain. Without another word, Jack moved toward the entrance of the cave, his eyes scanning the horizon. He was ready. Zara hesitated for a moment, her heart aching with the thought of leaving him behind. But she knew what she had to do. She had to survive. "I'll see you again," Zara said, her voice breaking. "I promise." Jack nodded, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that told her he knew the truth. They both knew that this might be the last time they saw each other, but they didn't need words to understand the bond they shared. The bond forged in battle, in survival, in sacrifice. Zara took a deep breath, then turned and ran. She didn't look back. As she made her way toward the ship, the sound of gunfire echoed in the distance. Jack was holding them off, buying her the time she needed to escape. Zara's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Not when she had been given a second chance, a chance to make a difference. She would carry Jack's memory with her, and she would fight for his sacrifice. She would survive. She had to. Zara ran through the desert, her heart pounding in her chest. Every step felt like an eternity as the weight of her decision pressed down on her. She couldn't look back. She couldn't afford to. Jack had given his life for her, and she would make sure it wasn't in vain. She had to survive, had to make it back to the rebellion's fleet, and make the enemies who had destroyed her people pay for what they had done. The ship was in sight now, the sleek, silver craft waiting on the edge of the rocky terrain. Her heart surged with hope as she sprinted toward it, the dry desert air biting at her skin, the sand whipping around her legs. But even though she was closer than ever, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was leaving something behind, something she couldn't replace. She felt as if Jack's sacrifice had broken a part of her, and she wasn't sure how she would continue without that piece. When she reached the ship, the hatch opened with a hiss, and the small crew inside rushed to help her. The commander, a grizzled veteran who had fought beside her in the rebellion, grabbed her arm gently but firmly, pulling her into the safety of the ship. His face was lined with worry, but his eyes softened when he saw the blood staining her armor. "Zara, what happened?" he asked, his voice full of concern. She could hardly answer. Her throat felt dry, her heart heavy with loss. She had never expected to survive this long, but now that she had, she was uncertain of what to do next. She looked at the commander, her mind clouded with grief. "Jack," she started, her voice breaking. "He sacrificed himself to let me escape. He stayed behind so I could live." The commander's expression softened with sympathy. "He was a brave man, a warrior." Zara nodded, her eyes filling with tears she had been holding back since Jack's death. "I promised him I'd survive. I promised him I'd make his sacrifice mean something." She sat down in the corner of the ship, her body trembling as the adrenaline slowly began to wear off. The pain in her side was still there, but it felt distant now, overshadowed by the heaviness in her heart. She couldn't shake the image of Jack's face as he had stood in the cave, ready to give everything for her survival. She could still hear his words in her mind, telling her to live, telling her to keep fighting. The ship lifted off the ground with a soft hum, leaving the desert planet behind. As the craft soared into the dark expanse of space, Zara couldn't help but look out at the stars, her mind racing with thoughts of the rebellion, of her people, and of the future. She had survived. But what now? What would she do with the second chance she had been given? The journey back to the fleet was long and silent, the ship cutting through the endless void of space. Zara sat alone, staring out at the stars, lost in her thoughts. The stars had always seemed so distant, so unreachable. But now, they felt different. They felt like a promise, a glimmer of hope in the vast darkness. Jack had believed in her, had trusted her to carry on the fight. She wouldn't let him down. She couldn't. As the ship approached the rebel fleet, Zara's resolve grew stronger. She had no time to mourn. The enemy had already shown how ruthless they could be, and the rebellion was far from over. Her people needed her. The galaxy needed her. When the ship docked, Zara was met by the leaders of the rebellion, their eyes scanning her with a mix of surprise and concern. They had all heard about the defeat, about the loss of the last stronghold, but they hadn't known the full story. hadn't known that she had been the one to survive, the one to escape. Ziara stood tall, despite the exhaustion that weighed on her shoulders, despite the grief that still clung to her heart. "Ziara," the leader said, his voice full of respect. "You've returned, and you're not alone. We'll rebuild. We'll rise again." Ziara's eyes met his, a fierce determination in her gaze. "The rebellion isn't over. We will fight back. We will make them pay for what they've done to our people. But this time, we do it right. We don't make the same mistakes again." The leader nodded. "We'll need your strength. We'll need your leadership." Ziara's heart swelled with a new sense of purpose. She wasn't just the rebellious princess anymore. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a leader. She was the future of her people, and she would lead them to victory. As she stood in the war room, surrounded by the remnants of her people, Ziara felt a fire ignite within her. The war wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The enemy might have taken everything from her, but they hadn't taken her will to fight. And as long as she was alive, they would never win. Ziara knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. She knew there would be more battles, more sacrifices, and more pain. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a sense of clarity. She had a purpose, and she wasn't going to stop until her people were free. Her mind turned to Jack again, and she whispered a silent vow to him, wherever he was. "I will make sure your sacrifice means something. I'll fight for you, for us, for all of us." The stars outside the ship's window glittered brightly, like the possibility of a new beginning. Ziara turned away from the window and faced the future. It was uncertain, yes, and there would be struggles along the way, but she was ready. She would lead her people to victory. She would carry the memory of Jack's sacrifice with her, and she would make sure it was never forgotten. A new chapter had begun, and this time they would win.